Despite pleas to close the skies over Ukraine, the NATO alliance has so far stayed away from direct action there, even as Russia continues its brutal attack on the country. But that doesn't mean that NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, isn't an interested party in what's going on now and in the future. And some argue a reason the invasion began in the first place. With us now for some perspective on all of that, and as is our custom here, we'll introduce our guests from furthest away to closest to our studio, starting in Colorado Springs, Colorado, with David Hendrickson. He's a professor emeritus of political science at Colorado College, specializing in American foreign policy and international affairs. In Middletown, Rhode Island, Tom Nichols, professor at the U.S. Naval War College and a contributing writer to The Atlantic. In our nation's capital, Paul Robinson, professor at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, specializing in Russia, international security and defense policy. And in Burlington, Ontario, Catherine Stoner, Mosbacher Director of the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law at Stanford University, and the author of Russia Resurrected: Its Power and Purpose in a New Global Order. And we're grateful to all four of you for joining us here on TVO tonight. Let us start by just stipulating off the top here, this is obviously Putin's war. It's illegal. He made the decision to launch it. He is being condemned virtually unanimously around the world for doing so. Having said that, is there an argument to be made here that the West provoked Russia in some way and shares some blame for the state of affairs today? Let's get all of you on the record on that, and then we'll dive deeper. Go ahead, Tom Nichols, start us off.
It's nonsense. The Putin has been attacking his neighbors since 2008 in Georgia, 2014 in Crimea. The idea that NATO somehow provoked this is just silly. If anything, the North Atlantic Alliance has been going out of its way to try to not to antagonize Putin over the years. What's really bothering him is 40 million Ukrainians trying to practice democracy right on his doorstep. He didn't like it in 2014. He doesn't like it now. Catherine
Stoner, what say you?
I emphatically agree with Tom, and I think people who are making these arguments are basically mimicking the Kremlin narrative. There was not an imminent offer on the table for Ukraine to join NATO. There wasn't in 2014, and as we're seeing, NATO isn't exactly coming to Ukraine's rescue now, and membership is not on the table. It's not a process that can be done quickly. It has, on average, taken 8 to 10 years. The last countries on Russia's border to join NATO joined in 2004, and that was the Baltic republics. And then I think if we can think of what Europe was like or would be like without NATO, a military alliance, then we can think back to the situation before the end of the Second World War, rather than a Europe whole and free, which is what we've had. And I would just emphasize what Tom said in terms of what the real threat here is. The threat is of a democratic, Western-facing country in Ukraine as a demonstration of what could be for Russians who are stuck in a personalistic autocracy under Vladimir Putin that has been increasingly grabbing their civil rights from them.
David Hendrickson, your view on that question?
Well, yes, I think we bear a tremendous amount of responsibility. We've made a whole series of decisions over the last 20 years. First, to demand that, or to put Ukraine's membership in NATO on the table. That represented a departure from the solution in the 1990s, which was neutrality. We sponsored the revolution in 2014, which was a really serious breach of international law and Ukraine's constitutional law, which had the effect of violating the electoral law and thereby handing power to extremists. It split the country. In the most recent episode, NATO expansion was a magic trick, a kind of now you see it, now you don't. To the Russians, yes, you are to understand this as a threat. To the Ukrainians, yes, you are to understand this as reassurance. To the American people, we don't want to get involved. Well, that magic trick ended very badly in the current circumstance. And to say that we had nothing to do with it is to say that, well, it was inevitable. He was going to invade anyway. He's a monster and will do what monsters do, but I don't think that's a plausible reconstruction of what happened.
Paul Robinson, your take.
I think provoke is too strong a word. We didn't provoke Russia, but no decision is made absent of any context. And I think what is clear is that Western states, both individually and collectively over the past 20, 25 years, have taken a number of decisions which has created a very paranoid atmosphere in Moscow and created the conditions in which this seems to be a logical thing for them to do. And this dates back from the war in Kosovo, through the invasion of Iraq, bombing of Libya, NATO expansion, America's dismantlement of the Cold War arms control system, the Maidan revolution, and so on and so forth. As for this democracy argument, I don't believe it, because Russia has very good relations, for instance, with Armenia, which is a democracy, and in fact bailed out Armenia in its recent war against Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan, of course, is not a democracy. So you see in that case, actually, Russia coming to the aid of a democracy against the autocracy. So the idea of this is all about democracy, I think, is a red herring.
Okay, all our viewers and listeners now know where you four stand on this issue, so let's go for a second round here. And Tom, to that end, you heard quite a litany there of moments in history where, in the view of Professor Robinson, NATO could have done something that might have changed where we are today. Has he persuaded you at all that something on that list might be valuable?
No. And in fact, my initial inclination in the 1990s, I was a go slow on NATO expansion advocate. I did not want to have a particularly rapid expansion of NATO because I think the Western nations needed to have a deliberate debate about admitting countries. The person who really talked me out of that and who really convinced me that NATO expansion was absolutely necessary was Vladimir Putin. And when we talk about this paranoid atmosphere in Moscow, that's not the creation of the West. That's the creation of a man who is dedicated to holding on to power at all costs, of a paranoid mafia boss who governs as a dictator, keeps his inner circle off balance with each other, surprised his own people with this absolutely insane invasion of Ukraine, including some of his own military and security people, some of whom he now has under house arrest because they couldn't figure out how to do this. The notion that somehow we've been provoking Russia over the years, when in fact we reached out with the NATO-Russia Founding Act, with including Russia in the G8, with treating Russia as a peer power, trying to be respectful of their concerns. But that doesn't work when you're dealing with essentially a mafia don who has decided that he must stay in power at all costs. And part of the way he does that is by constantly sparking wars on his borders. And I'll just add one last thing. The red herring here is a discussion of Armenia. Armenia is not the Slavic heart of the former Russian Empire. The Armenians can do a lot of things that Vladimir Putin doesn't care about. But Kiev and 40 million Slavs in between NATO and the Russian border is a different matter entirely. And I think it's really misleading to say, well, he helped out Armenia and but that is the Armenia-Azerbaijan situation has been a lot more complicated than that. Russia's been interfering there since the early 90s, keeping both of those countries basically in conflict with each other while they put border guards and other quote unquote peacekeepers into those situations. So that's just a completely inappropriate analogy.
Okay, Catherine, if provoking is too strong a word to be used as we consider this debate here, how about this? Was there a diplomatic avenue at some point over the last decade or more that NATO and or the West missed that might have changed the status quo today?
I think I wouldn't say that we haven't made some mistakes, and I think withdrawing unilaterally from some of the arms control agreements over the last several years was one of those. However, the reason we did that was because Russia was clearly violating, in particular, the ABM treaty and the INF treaty too, frankly, with the kinds of weapons they were using. But I also want to correct the record here in terms of what some of our colleagues have said. To say that the U.S. or the West sponsored the Maidan Revolution of 2014. Well, of course, that's nonsense. And I just want to reiterate what Tom said there. You know, this perspective that we somehow have provoked Russia is absurd. It gives no agency to the Ukrainians themselves. And this is Mr. Putin's paranoid global view. And it is a view of the 19th century where great powers struggle against one another and the little peoples in between have no independent agency. And so hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets to protest a corrupt, incompetent government, as they did in Ukraine beginning in the fall of 2013 and 2014, cannot possibly be genuine or spontaneous. It must be managed by other great powers. And this is, of course, ridiculous. That's not the case. It's an insult to the Ukrainians who got out on the street, and about 100 or so who were frankly shot dead on the advice of the Russian security services and a president backed by Russia, and who now lives in Russia. So there's nothing that the U.S. did then or in 2004 to encourage color revolutions. That's absurd. Look at the Ukrainians themselves now. Are those U.S. soldiers out there or Canadians who are holding back the Russians from invading their country unprovoked for no reason under a false pretense of some sort of genocide going on inside their own country in these two provinces? So that's ridiculous. Second, there is to consider Armenia democracy or important in this particular conflict is ridiculous. Armenia is under what circumstances is Armenia a consolidated democracy? That's certainly news to most of us here. There have been moves in that direction, but Russia has also moved in quite quickly to basically control the Armenian economy, which is what it does, and that's the problem in Ukraine. Ukraine was getting out of control. A country of 44 million people. What provoked Maidan in 2014 was the then president Yanukovych not wanting to sign an accession agreement to the European Union, not NATO, the European Union. That's an economic bloc. It's not a military bloc. And so the issue here is one of ideology. We can also imagine a counterfactual, and this is where I'll end, where Mr. Putin is not president and Russia pursues its legitimate security interests a different way. And that is, in fact, what we did by forming the NATO-Russia Council. But we wouldn't give Russia a veto on who joins NATO. And that's because of the NATO Founding Act, which has an open door policy. Notice, however, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, was not about to be a member of NATO, and that's the same with Georgia too. And the last thing I'll point out is that in terms of sovereignty and security being respected, one thing that's completely left out by the realists in this narrative is that in 2004, in 1994, Boris Yeltsin, Mr. Putin's predecessor as Russian president, signed a Budapest memorandum guaranteeing Ukraine's sovereignty in exchange for the legacy nuclear weapons left there upon the Soviet collapse. And that's the only agreement that has been violated here.
Okay, you have taken us back to the 1990s, and I'd like to stay there with David Hendrickson for this next question, because the story goes that during the George Bush the father administration, his Secretary of State, James Baker, said to Mikhail Gorbachev, "Don't worry, NATO won't move 1 inch eastward towards your country." This was allegedly a promise given and allegedly a promise broken. Do you think that, first of all, do you buy the story? And second of all, is that part of the explanation for where we're at today?
Yeah, I think it is part of the explanation. I mean, we clearly broke our promise. I mean, to say that they didn't get it in writing, therefore it's invalid. Of course, if circumstances change, we can change our mind. Are not explanations that you would accept if you had been given bona fides by another party. I want to return to the Maidan, though, the 2014 question, because that's absolutely crucial. Now, we had a challenge to our electoral law on January 6th, and every right-thinking person knew that that was a totally wrong thing to do. The electoral law is the most important question that constitutions answer, and the question is, who rules? Who holds power? Now, Tom and Catherine take the view that in a constitutional democracy, it's perfectly fine to do that. If the president makes a bad trade law, well, of course, the response is to gather 500,000 people in the capital city in a nation of 45 million people and change it and drive him out. That's what happened.
Friends, if I can, let me get us back on the path here, because we really want to, we want to focus on whether, and again, we may agree that provoking is too strong a word, but whether there were opportunities missed over the intervening decades between the end of communism and where we are today, in which NATO has to look in the mirror and say, had we done something differently at this point, maybe Russia would not have invaded. And I really want to explore that there. And to that end, okay, Paul Robinson, let me follow this up with you. Again, allegedly, the story goes that in 2008, NATO said to Ukrainian and/or Georgian officials, yes, at some point down the road, we would entertain the idea of you being in NATO. In hindsight, was that a mistake?
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about lost opportunities, I think it's important to particularly think about the war in Donbass and how that could have been brought to an end, and this whole disaster, frankly, would have been avoided. And Catherine made a good point about agency when she said that the protesters on Maidan were not acting on behalf of Western states. They were their own agents. Though I would add that it would have been better had we not got involved. Our own foreign secretary, Mr. Baird, turned up at Maidan and gave support. Our embassy opened its doors to the protesters. I mean, imagine if Sergei Lavrov had turned up here in Ottawa during the truck protests and the Russian embassy down the street here had opened up its doors. We would have been outraged. But beyond that, they then started a war in Donbass. And again, taking this point about agency, there have been multiple academic surveys of what happened in 2014 during the so-called Russian Spring, and also surveys by independent groups such as the International Crisis Group, who are not pro-Russian in any way. And they have all made the same point, that this anti-Maidan Russian Spring was very largely a bottom-up, spontaneous process in which the people of Donbass themselves displayed their own agency. So this is an internal Ukrainian conflict. It's not just a Russian-Ukrainian conflict. But we in the West never, ever wanted to recognize that. And we supported the Ukrainian government when it waged war on its own people, when it shelled its own people for 8 years, killing hundreds of civilians, incidentally, in Donbass. And then in 2015, there were these so-called Minsk agreements. And the key point in the Minsk agreements was that there should be a special status, in other words, political autonomy for the Donetsk and Lugansk provinces. Now, Ukrainian government refused repeatedly to carry this out. Despite having pledged to do this, it said it wouldn't. And indeed, in recent months, it made it very, very clear to everybody that it had absolutely no intention of doing this. This, despite the fact it was the only way in practice of resolving this war peacefully. And the problem is that we in the West made no effort to use our leverage over Ukraine to persuade it to do what had to be done. Instead, we said to Ukraine, we support you, whatever you do. Here's money, here's weapons, here's military training, and if you don't carry out these, don't do this compromise, well, so what? And in that sense, we gave the Ukrainians absolutely no incentive to bring the war to an end through some sort of compromise. And in that way, I think we led to an ever worsening situation in which the Russian government decided there was no way out other than acting in this way. That doesn't justify what they did, which was an enormous overreaction, but still, by pushing the Maidan Revolution, which we did support, even if we didn't produce it, and by supporting the Ukrainian government in its war against Donbass, by not inducing it to make peace, we have helped create the situation in which this war happened.
Okay, Tom Nichols, I see you're shaking your head, so I'm going to give you a chance to follow up.
I'm sorry, I have to bring this whole discussion somehow back to reality, because, David and Paul are talking about, the poor Russians being just goaded into all of this by these terrible things that happened in Ukraine. And the big part that everybody's skipping. First, let me just say that I think David's comparison of January 6th to Maidan is atrocious. I mean, it is, a 240-year-old consolidated democracy as opposed to a country that is still trying to consolidate a democracy against a pro-Russian stooge in their presidential palace who's specifically trying on his own, against the wishes, including of people in his own parliament, to join the European Union, which actually scares Putin more than NATO. I'll agree with Paul about one thing. NATO should never have said, okay, Georgia and Ukraine, it's going to happen. It'll happen down the line. The Russians have been dining out on that statement for 12 years. But we're talking about all of this as though these internal Ukrainian problems are somehow a reason to seize territory from a sovereign state. It's insane. David has said, well, we're not justifying it. I'm sorry, gentlemen, you are both justifying it. You're talking about the war in 2014 breaking out as though it were some sort of force of nature, as opposed to a tantrum from Vladimir Putin, who seized areas full of people that were going to be sympathetic to his views, de facto partitioning the country, and then saying to the Ukrainians, I will hold you responsible for protecting your own country and your own sovereignty. This would be like saying, to take David's completely inappropriate January 6th example, that would be like the Russians saying, well, there's trouble in Washington, so therefore we have the right to seize Texas. I mean, this is crazy.
Okay, let me get David to.
We're treating Putin as though he doesn't exist in all of this, and we're jumping right to what happens after all of this territory has been seized, and then basically blaming the victim here as if they have no right to defend themselves.
David, let me get you to speak to Tom's argument about the notion that your comments could be interpreted as a justification for what's transpired.
Yeah. Any criticism of American policy is ipso facto pro-Putin. So, that's a way of shutting down all argument whatsoever.
Also true.
Look, if we go back to 2014, those people in the East have a different identity from the people in the West in Ukraine. That's just a fact. Now, you can say all you want about the illegality of the secession of Crimea, but that's what the people in that territory wanted. And it's what the people in the Donbass wanted. That's not fake. That's not a result of Vladimir Putin stepping in. It's real. They don't want to be governed by Kiev. And, it's my view that a violation of the electoral law in any state annuls the Constitution. If you break the Constitution and seize power, you can no longer appeal to it. And I've appealed in my writings to such honorable spokesmen as Daniel Webster to make out that point. I mean, my reasoning is based entirely upon the way in which constitutions were built in the American tradition. And if you violate it, you've annulled it. You can't appeal to it. You're in a state of nature in which political authority is up to the people to decide who they want to obey. The people in the East, didn't want to obey the Kiev authorities. That's just the way it is. Now, the whole narrative in the West is that Ukraine is this united nation of 44 million people, and everyone wants to hate the Russians and speak Ukrainian and go about their business. That's just an unreal description of what the country is. It was a cleft country, and it has been since the beginning. The only way to hold a country like that together is through compromise. Now, electoral machinery is the way in which compromises are effected. In a presidential election, and all the Ukrainian presidential elections were close, the dynamic is that if you want to win, there's a certain incentive to appeal to the middle. That's why we have constitutions. That's why we have the peaceful transfer of power.
Okay, let me get
Catherine and Tom. Just dismiss that.
Let me get
transfer of power. No. Can't have.
Thank you. Let me get Catherine
trade
Stoner.
Agreement. You've got to gather a crowd in the city and overthrow the government. That's just illegitimate. We didn't cause that. We didn't bring those people out into the streets, but we did say this is a legitimate way to get rid of Yanukovych, as opposed to telling them, wait a year for the next presidential elections. That's how it's done in a democracy. And to say that this other method, this method of getting a large crowd is the way to do it, is just insane from the standpoint of any constitutional text.
Okay, let me get Catherine Stoner in here for a second. And Catherine, I see you feverishly taking notes here, and you're going to forgive me, but the one thing I don't want to do any more of is further interpretation of what either did or didn't happen in the Maidan 8 years ago.
Sure.
We've had a great discussion about that already. What I want to see if I can move us towards right here, And, you know, from time to time, Canada does things that either help or don't help in this circumstance. And I want to refer you to a tweet that the former Minister of Defense, when the Conservatives were in power, Peter MacKay, tweeted out. It was a picture of Putin, I guess it was a cartoon of Putin looking at his reflection and seeing Hitler's image staring back at him. I don't know. Weigh in on that if you would. Does that, is that helpful? Is that accurate?
I don't know. I don't think Mr. Putin particularly cares what we think about him in the West and what comics are tweeted out or not. He's convinced himself that this is, you know, the legacy he will leave the Russian people and the next generation of Russians, that, you know, the uniting or gathering of the lands. And by that, he means Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia.
Are you confident that's all he wants?
No, I actually think he thinks in a 19th century way, and the little peoples of you know, Ukraine and the lands in between, as they're called, Russia and Europe, are to be split up, and we're to have power blocks. And the problem is, of course, when we've had that in the past, we've had wars. And so it's not if we're talking about legitimacy, a legitimate way to lead Russia, and all of the gains of the last 30 years that Russia has made, he's now squandering. So this is also in many ways a tragedy for the Russian people, not in the same way, of course, as the Ukrainians who are literally being killed. But to get back to some of the questions you asked about not 1 inch, you know, the statement about expanding NATO, well, I would refer our colleagues to an excellent book that just came out by Mary Sarati, a historian of the Cold War, called Not 1 Inch, which the nice thing is we can go to archives. We don't have to argue over facts. And in fact, it was a statement made to Gorbachev to say, what about if we did this to try and get NATO out, try and get the Warsaw Pact out of East Germany in particular. It was not a promise that was made. And in fact, we even have Gorbachev on the record saying that that's correct. They did not make a promise to me of that. It was an analogy. Gorbachev himself saying no promise was made. And this is just something that has been internalized into the press and the media because of Putin repeating it again and again, which is what propagandists do, right? Forgetting, of course, that his predecessor signed the 1994 Budapest Memorandum of respecting Ukrainian sovereignty. Also, you know, comment was made, so Lavrov showing up with the Canadian truckers wouldn't have been appropriate. So is it then more appropriate for the Russian military to show up in defense of Ukrainians who purportedly want to leave Ukraine or renegotiate their federal system? No, it's not, right? Nor is it appropriate to arm them. Nor is it appropriate to hold a referendum in Crimea, simply seized by Russia, where the only two choices in the referendum are, do you want to be part of Russia or do you want to be independent? So the third choice, do you want to still be part of Ukraine, wasn't even on the ballot in the referendum held in the middle of the seizure of power. In terms of supporting democracy when countries ask for it, I'm sorry, I just don't think it's the wrong thing to do if Ukraine wants self-determination.
Can I pick up on that? Hang on, Catherine, I'm going to pick up on that if I can, because I've got a graphic here that I want to bring up from Stephen Walt, the foreign policy expert at Harvard, who had the following to say, and then we'll get some comments on that. He writes, Putin is not solely responsible for the ongoing crisis over Ukraine, and moral outrage over his actions or character is not a strategy. Unpleasant as it may be, the United States and its allies need to recognize that Ukraine's geopolitical alignment is a vital interest for Russia, one it is willing to use force to defend. And this is not because Putin happens to be a ruthless autocrat with a nostalgic fondness for the old Soviet past. Great powers are never indifferent to the geostrategic forces arrayed on their borders, and Russia would care deeply about Ukraine's political alignment even if someone else were in charge. U.S. and European unwillingness to accept this basic reality is a major reason the world is in this mess today. Tom, discuss.
This is the classic language of American realism, and Steve Walt is kind of along with John Mearsheimer, he's kind of the dean of American realists, where the world is full of these kind of, largely indistinguishable billiard balls that roll around on a table and bump into each other, and that they have these kinds of interests that must always be expressed in the way that they're expressed through power. What's missing from all of this is that these are real countries with real cultures run by real people. One of the things that's been missing, for example, both from Steve Walt's comment and from this discussion, is the really malign influence here that nationalist Orthodox Church leaders have been playing in advising Putin here and basically convincing him, as Catherine's been pointing out, that he is going to be the great Russian leader that will reunite Orthodoxy. And I say this with a great deal of pain. I am an Orthodox believer. I'm an Orthodox Christian. But this is a gigantic schism in the Orthodox world, and it's been something that's been driving Putin that realists like Walt and others don't want to talk about, because they don't think culture matters. They don't think history matters. They think what matters is big powers jostling for advantage. Of course it's true. And only a fool would say that Russia could be indifferent to Ukraine and its security situation. But to somehow go from that to, and that's how you get Russia leveling apartment blocks and schools and nursing homes, is ridiculous. It's a way of talking about this in a very clinical, detached way, as though Vladimir Putin isn't a real person who is doing these things for his own reasons. This is not a war that's popular, as far as we can tell, in Russia. This was a war that was launched initially by Putin talking about rescuing his brothers and sisters. I wanted to go back to one point Catherine, I think, was trying to make, that these geopolitical arguments, if these were such strong arguments, Putin wouldn't be talking about Nazis. I mean, this is paranoid. This is paranoid, delusional talk, and we have to deal with the fact that this is what happens when you have power invested in one dictatorial leader who is, in fact, Steve Walt's wrong. Putin is, in fact, nostalgic for the old Soviet Empire and has said so, and he intends to recover those lands. And I was one of the people, I just want to say this very quickly, I was one of the people who really, and David Hendrickson knows this because we talked about this many years ago, I was one of the people who resisted treating Putin this way. I actually thought there was a chance to get along with Russia and to get along with Putin, and I resisted these kinds of Cold War metaphors. I was wrong. Putin has talked me out of it. He is what he seems to be, and we should be dealing with that reality instead of thinking again about all of these justifications, which are not, I'm sorry to say, David, these are not, doesn't mean that accuses anyone of being pro-Putin. It means that it's basically always anti-NATO. And that doesn't make any sense. The facts on the ground at this moment in history do not support that argument. Okay, let me get Paul Robinson in here because I haven't heard from Paul in a while. And I want to make this analogy, and you tell me, Paul, if it makes any sense. I think we all remember back to our high school history classes and the Monroe Doctrine, and anything that took place in the Western Hemisphere, the United States said, that's our interest, that's our sphere of influence, don't monkey around in our backyard. Are we essentially seeing Russia expressing its own Monroe Doctrine right now in Eastern Europe?
Well, to some degree, yes. I mean, I think Stephen Wald is right, but state leaders do consider certain things to be vital interests. Whether they're right or wrong to view it that way is another issue. And this doesn't have to divorce culture. In fact, this may be considered a vital interest precisely because of some perceived cultural link with the place in person. And it's very dangerous for you to poke your fingers into something which somebody else considers their vital interest, because if they consider it a vital interest, they will fight for it. And if it's only a secondary interest for you, you will not fight for it. And therefore, what you're doing is essentially saying, messing around, you're messing in somewhere where they're willing to fight and you're not. And that, it strikes me, is a rather dangerous and irresponsible thing to do. And I think, it's a lesson we need to think about when going forward in treating other powers such as China. And for instance, if you're talking about Taiwan or the South China Sea and so on, and bear in mind that, they consider it, rightly or wrongly, a vital interest, and they will fight for these places. And if you poke your nose into it, then you're causing trouble. And I don't think that should be equated with excusing or taking a pro-Kremlin line or anything like that. One can draw an analogy here with, say, crime. If when someone commits a crime, they are responsible. We hold them responsible. They have free will, and that applies in this case too. But any criminological policy which was based purely on the idea that crimes are caused because people are bad would be a very bad criminological policy, because we all know that crime has a sociological, economic, social context, which must be considered when you want to understand why things happen. And discussing the context and discussing the ways you may have contributed to that context is not excusing, it's not removing responsibility, it's getting a proper understanding of a situation so that you can avoid such problems in the future. And if we simply refuse to do that, then going forward, dealing particularly with China, we're going to run into this problem over again and cause ourselves a lot of trouble.
All right, with just a couple of minutes left here, time has truly flown by. David Hendrickson, let me get you on this. The issue of opportunities missed by NATO notwithstanding, is there any doubt in your mind that Ukraine right now feels utterly betrayed by Russia, mortified by Russia, far more than whatever misgivings or concerns it's had about NATO missing opportunities?
Well, they feel betrayed by both sides. I mean, it's a different
Equally?
feeling.
Both sides equally?
Well, no, not equally, but listen to Zelensky. I mean, he's furious. His whole rhetoric for a year is, are you with us or not? And he received messages that, well, we're kind of with you, but no, we're really not with you. And I think that put them out on a limb. I want to make one more point, though. We have launched a total economic war against Russia. I see zero possibility of a political settlement. These sanctions are semi-permanent, if not eternal. That means a total recasting of international political economy, and it's going to be a tremendously wealth-destroying instrument. That's what these sanctions are. And it's a very dangerous situation. China's going to be brought into it. The whole world is going to be brought into it because there are no more neutrals, according to Washington. I don't think we've begun to think about the economic fallout from that, and we need to.
I appreciate so much everybody being prepared to have this debate on TVO tonight. It was very civilized considering the strength of the disagreement here. So thanks to David Hendrickson from Colorado College, Paul Robinson, University of Ottawa, Catherine Stoner, Stanford University, Tom Nichols, the U.S. Naval War College. It's been great having all of you on our program tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.